The afternoon sun was bright as it shone down on the quiet neighborhood, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. Birds chirped in the trees, and everything seemed peaceful. But in the middle of this calm, something strange was happening. A little girl, around 8 years old, ran quickly down the street. Her small feet pounded against the pavement as she looked nervously over her shoulder. Her breathing was fast and heavy, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She was afraid, very afraid. Her name was Emma, and something, or someone, was chasing her. Emma's dark eyes were wide with fear. She had been walking home from school like she always did when she noticed a man following her. At first, it was just a strange feeling in her stomach, but when she looked behind her, she saw the man walking a few steps behind, his face hidden under the shadow of a hood. His eyes never left her, and the feeling of being watched made Emma's heart race. She tried to walk faster, but the man kept getting closer. She could hear his footsteps behind her, heavy and steady. Each time she turned to look, he was still there, following her, never slowing down. Emma's legs grew tired, but she kept running. The fear inside her was stronger than any tiredness she felt. Now she was almost at Mrs. Jenkins' house. Mrs. Jenkins was an elderly woman who lived alone, and Emma often stopped by her house to say hello. Mrs. Jenkins had a big garden with flowers, and always had cookies ready when Emma came over. Today, Emma didn't stop to chat. She didn't even slow down. As she reached the front steps of Mrs. Jenkins' porch, Emma stumbled and fell. Her hand scraped the ground, but she didn't stop. She quickly pushed herself up and ran the last few steps to the door. Her hands shook as she knocked. Inside, Mrs. Jenkins, who was sitting on the porch in her favorite rocking chair, looked up when she heard the knock. She smiled, thinking it was just Emma stopping by to say hello. But when she opened the door, her smile faded. The look in Emma's eyes was not the usual cheerful one she had seen before. Emma's face was pale, and she was gasping for breath. "Emma, what's wrong, child?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, stepping aside to let the girl in. Without saying a word, Emma ran inside and collapsed on the couch, still breathing heavily. Her body shook with fear, and her small hands clutched the fabric of the couch like she was holding onto something for dear life. Mrs. Jenkins hurried over to her. "What happened, dear? Are you okay?" Emma's chest heaved as she tried to calm down, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. She wiped her sweaty brow and glanced over her shoulder, looking out through the window. I don't know. I think he's still following me," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Jenkins frowned. "Who's following you? Who is it, child?" Emma turned her eyes back to Mrs. Jenkins, and in a shaky voice, she explained, "There's a man. He's been following me for a long time. Every day. I thought he would leave me alone. But today, he was closer. He's always watching." Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly closed the door and locked it, then peered through the curtains. There was no one in sight, but she couldn't ignore the fear in Emma's eyes. Mrs. Jenkins had known Emma since she was a baby. This was not the usual playful little girl who would visit her to talk about school or her day. This was someone who had seen something that scared her, something real. "Are you sure, Emma? Are you sure it's the same man?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice gentle but full of concern. Emma nodded. "He's always there. I see him every day after school, just walking behind me. I didn't think he would ever hurt me, but today, he was too close. I felt like he was going to grab me." Mrs. Jenkins knelt down beside Emma, taking her small hand in hers. "I want you to stay calm, okay? You're safe here with me, but we're going to make sure no one hurts you. We'll call the police." Emma nodded, though her eyes were still wide with fear. Mrs. Jenkins tried to comfort her, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in her heart. She reached for her phone and dialed 911, her hands slightly shaking. "Hello, I need to report a situation. A young girl has been followed by a man. He's been stalking her, and she's afraid he's going to hurt her. We need help." As she spoke, she glanced outside again, her eyes scanning the street. There was still no sign of the man, but Emma's words kept ringing in her ears. "He's still following me." Mrs. Jenkins finished the call and sat next to Emma, trying to reassure her, but inside, she was just as frightened as the little girl. Who was this man? Why was he following Emma? And what did he want with her? Mrs. Jenkins knew she had to protect Emma, but something told her that this was just the beginning of something much darker. She kept her eyes on the window, waiting for any sign that the man might be close. Something told her that this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. The question was, what was his plan? The air inside Mrs. Jenkins' house was heavy with tension. The once quiet neighborhood now felt ominous, as if the warm summer afternoon had somehow turned colder. Emma sat on the couch, still clutching her knees, her small body trembling. Mrs. Jenkins, who had always been the calm, steady presence in Emma's life, was now looking out the window with a furrowed brow, her mind racing. There was something about the way Emma had described the man that sent a chill down Mrs. Jenkins' spine. She had seen many things in her long life, her share of troubles, dangers, and hard times, but nothing like this. Who would want to follow a little girl? And why? Mrs. Jenkins had always trusted the safety of their small town, but now she wasn't so sure. "I'm scared, Mrs. Jenkins. He's going to get me," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. Mrs. Jenkins turned away from the window, trying to offer a comforting smile, but the truth was, she didn't know if everything was going to be okay. She had lived through some difficult times, but nothing like this. She never imagined her peaceful home would be threatened by such a frightening stranger. The sound of the phone ringing startled them both. Mrs. Jenkins rushed to pick it up, hoping it was the police with some good news. But when she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't what she expected. "Mrs. Jenkins, is everything okay over there?" the voice on the phone asked. It was the school principal, Mr. Walker. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was holding back something important. Mrs. Jenkins' heart skipped a beat. "What's going on, Mr. Walker? Why are you calling?" "There's something you need to know," Mr. Walker said. "We just received a report from a concerned parent. It seems there's been a man hanging around the school, near the playground. He's been asking strange questions about the children, and he might have been watching Emma." Mrs. Jenkins felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean by asking strange questions?" she demanded. "They say he asked about her specifically," Mr. Walker continued. "And when the teachers tried to speak to him, he quickly left. We've alerted the authorities, but I thought you should know. We don't want any more surprises." Mrs. Jenkins quickly thanked him and hung up the phone. Her mind was racing. Could this man have been watching Emma for longer than she realized? Could he have followed her from school today? Turning to Emma, Mrs. Jenkins placed her hand gently on the little girl's shoulder. "Sweetheart, we need to stay strong. The police are on their way, and everything will be okay." But Emma was not convinced. She looked out the window again, her eyes scanning the empty street. She was scared, and for good reason. Emma had seen the man before, on her way home from school. She knew his face, but today something was different. He had been closer than ever before. "I don't want to go back out there," Emma said, her voice shaking. "You won't have to, Emma. I won't let anything happen to you," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice firm, though doubt lingered in her chest. Just then, a loud knock on the door interrupted the silence. Emma jumped, and Mrs. Jenkins felt her heart race again. Could it be the police already, or was it the man? She slowly approached the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She peered through the peephole and sighed in relief when she saw 2 police officers standing outside. She quickly opened the door. "Are you Mrs. Jenkins?" one of the officers asked. Yes, I am," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Come in, please." The officers stepped inside, and one of them glanced at Emma, who was still sitting on the couch, her face pale with fear. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the officer asked. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, though her own heart was still heavy with worry. "We've received a report about a suspicious man in the area," the officer continued. "We've also been alerted about a child, Emma, who might be at risk." "I think it's him," Emma whispered, her voice so quiet that only Mrs. Jenkins could hear. "He's the one I saw today." The officer turned to Emma. "Do you know who he is, sweetheart?" Emma shook her head. "I don't know his name, but he's been following me for days. He just watches me." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We're going to take care of this," he assured Emma. "We'll find this man and make sure you're safe." But Mrs. Jenkins could see the doubt in their eyes. They weren't sure what they were dealing with, and neither was she. Emma had described the man as someone who had been following her, but how could they be sure it was the same person? The officers asked a few more questions, but Mrs. Jenkins didn't have many answers. She didn't know what to say. All she knew was that a little girl was terrified, and a dangerous man could still be lurking around. As the officers left to begin their search, Mrs. Jenkins locked the door once more. She sat down beside Emma, who had her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I'll stay here with you, Emma," Mrs. Jenkins said softly. "We'll get through this together." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much worse. The man wasn't gone. Mrs. Jenkins could feel it in her bones. And if he was really out there, what did he want with Emma? The questions piled up, but one thing was clear. Emma was not safe yet. The search begins. Rising tension. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Mrs. Jenkins sat next to Emma, her hand gently resting on the little girl's trembling shoulder. The sounds of the outside world seemed distant now, drowned out by the pounding of Mrs. Jenkins' own heart. The officers had left to search the area, but there was a hollow silence in the house that felt heavier than ever. "Do you think they'll find him?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Jenkins didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure. She wished she could say yes, that everything would be fine, but something in her gut told her that the danger wasn't over yet. The man was still out there, and he might be closer than they thought. "I'm sure they're doing their best, Emma. They'll find him soon," she finally said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. The officers had told her that they would canvass the area, questioning neighbors and looking for any signs of the mysterious man. But what if he wasn't just hiding in the neighborhood? What if he was already gone, slipping away like a shadow, leaving no trace behind? Mrs. Jenkins stood up, trying to act calm, but inside, she was anything but. She began to pace around the living room, glancing out the window every few seconds. Her thoughts raced. She thought about the look on Emma's face when she first whispered about the man, the fear in her wide eyes that sent a chill down Mrs. Jenkins' spine. Emma had been so certain, so sure that she wasn't imagining things. She couldn't just sit here waiting. She needed to do something. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Mrs. Jenkins jumped, her heart leaping in her chest. It was a text from the officer who had visited earlier. "Nothing so far. Keep an eye out. We'll check back soon." Mrs. Jenkins sighed and dropped the phone on the couch. "Nothing. Again," she muttered, but Emma had already seen the text. "They haven't found him yet?" Emma asked, her voice full of fear. "No, not yet, sweetheart," Mrs. Jenkins replied, trying her best to sound reassuring. She walked over to the window, peering outside once more, but the street looked the same as it had all afternoon, empty, quiet, peaceful. But that quiet now felt like a lie. It was a false sense of security, a calm before a storm she could feel in the air. Her mind was racing, but then something caught her eye. It was faint, almost like a shadow moving quickly across the alley behind the house. Mrs. Jenkins squinted, unsure if it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. She turned to Emma, who was sitting stiffly on the couch, her eyes wide and alert. "Emma, stay here," Mrs. Jenkins said quietly. She wasn't sure what she had seen, but something inside her told her to check it out. She grabbed her phone and slipped it into her pocket, then cautiously made her way to the back door. "Don't go outside, Mrs. Jenkins," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll be right back. Stay inside. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone," Mrs. Jenkins instructed, her voice firm, though her hands were shaking. She stepped outside into the cool air, the scent of grass and earth heavy in her nostrils. The street was quiet, as it had been all day, but Mrs. Jenkins felt an unsettling feeling creeping up her spine. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows of the alley where she had seen movement just moments ago. Nothing. She took a deep breath and started walking cautiously toward the alley. It was dark now, with only the streetlights offering any light. Mrs. Jenkins kept her phone ready, just in case. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She rounded the corner into the alley, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air felt colder now, and her breath came out in small puffs as she walked slowly, trying not to make a sound. The alley was narrow, lined with old, rusted garbage cans and overgrown vines. She looked around but saw nothing unusual. Just as she was about to turn back, a noise startled her. Something moved in the shadows to her right. Mrs. Jenkins froze. Her heart skipped a beat as her eyes darted toward the sound. She couldn't see much, but there was definitely something, or someone, there. Her pulse quickened. Was it him? Was the man watching her now, just like he had been watching Emma? Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the dumpster, and Mrs. Jenkins gasped. But it wasn't the man she was expecting. It was one of the officers. "Mrs. Jenkins, what are you doing out here?" the officer asked, his tone a mix of concern and surprise. Mrs. Jenkins let out a shaky breath, her relief evident. "I thought I saw something," she explained, trying to calm herself down. "I thought it might have been him." The officer looked around the alley with a sharp gaze. "It's all right, ma'am. We're checking everywhere. We'll find him." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't go away. The officer might have seemed confident, but she wasn't so sure. The man was still out there, and Emma wasn't safe yet. The shocking discovery. The night had fallen completely, casting everything in a thick veil of darkness. The only light came from the flickering street lamps, their faint glow casting long shadows on the ground. Mrs. Jenkins stood in the alley, her heart still racing after the officer's sudden appearance. She felt foolish, but she couldn't help herself. Something about the situation just didn't sit right with her. "I think you should go back inside, Mrs. Jenkins," the officer said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll keep looking. We've got other units coming in." But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't ready to leave. She couldn't. She needed to know that Emma was safe. No, she had to make sure she was safe. The worry gnawed at her, and she looked over at the officer with a pleading expression. "I'm sorry. I know you're doing your best, but this just doesn't feel right. Something about all of this is off," she said, her voice shaking with anxiety. The officer, a man in his 30s, glanced around the alley once more before sighing and placing a hand on her shoulder. "I understand, but you need to stay calm. We'll find the person who did this." Just as Mrs. Jenkins was about to respond, a muffled sound came from deeper in the alley, a sound she couldn't quite identify. A rustling, a dragging noise, as though something or someone was moving against the debris in the dark. Mrs. Jenkins felt her heart skip a beat. She turned quickly to the officer, but he was already pulling out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. His eyes narrowed, and he gestured for her to stay back. "Stay here. I'll go check it out," he ordered, his voice low. He moved quickly toward the sound, his flashlight darting across the alley, illuminating piles of garbage and abandoned furniture. Mrs. Jenkins stood frozen, her breath coming fast and shallow, but she couldn't help but follow him with her eyes, her every muscle tense. Minutes seemed to stretch on like hours as she waited, the silence pressing in on her. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, the officer's flashlight shone on something in the shadows, something that made Mrs. Jenkins' blood run cold. She stepped forward, ignoring the officer's warnings to stay back, and inched closer to where the flashlight had landed. There, partially hidden behind a pile of old crates, was a large, heavy bag. But it wasn't just any bag. It looked out of place, its shape unnatural, and something about it made her stomach churn. The officer had already started to move toward it, but Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help herself. She reached down and grabbed the corner of the bag, pulling it away from the crates. What she saw made her gasp and stumble backward. Inside the bag, tightly bound and barely conscious, was a man, a middle-aged man, his face bruised and bloody. His hands were tied together with a thick rope, and he looked barely alive, his breathing shallow and ragged. What in the world? Mrs. Jenkins gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The officer quickly dropped to his knees beside the man, checking for signs of life. He's still breathing. Get the ambulance over here now, he shouted, pulling out his radio. Mrs. Jenkins felt a mixture of relief and confusion flood over her. Who was this man? And why was he here, hidden away in a bag in the alley? Her thoughts were spinning out of control. Just moments ago, she had been searching for the danger that might be lurking in the shadows, and now she had found it. Except, it wasn't the person she had feared. The officer didn't waste any time. Within moments, a second squad car arrived, followed by the ambulance. Paramedics quickly began tending to the man, cutting away the ropes and assessing his injuries. Who is he? Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice trembling with the urgency of her thoughts. What happened to him? The officer looked up at her, his expression unreadable. We don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. This could be the break we've been waiting for. As the paramedics loaded the man into the ambulance, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. She had expected to find something dangerous, but not this. She had been searching for one threat, but had stumbled upon another. The officer turned to her, his face serious now. Mrs. Jenkins, I need to ask you a few more questions. Do you know anything about this man? Was he someone you recognized? Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. I've never seen him before, but I don't understand. Why would he be tied up like that? What happened to him? The officer didn't have an answer. All he could offer was a grim nod. We'll find out soon enough. For now, let's go back to your house. It's safer there. As they walked back to the house, Mrs. Jenkins' mind was racing. There was still so much she didn't understand. Who was the man in the bag? And what had he been doing in the alley? The officer seemed to think this was a big clue, but Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. She had no idea how all of this fit together, but she had the sinking feeling that the truth was even more dangerous than she could imagine. When they finally reached her home, she found Emma sitting by the door, her wide eyes filled with worry. Mrs. Jenkins, what happened? What did they find? Emma asked urgently, standing up as soon as she saw her. Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath. We don't know yet, but we'll find out soon. And deep down, she knew that this discovery was only the beginning. The real danger was still out there, hiding in plain sight. The dark secrets unveiled. The days after the discovery in the alley were a blur for Mrs. Jenkins. Her mind kept circling back to the image of the man tied up in the bag, his eyes barely open, his body limp and bruised. Even after the paramedics took him away, there was a lingering feeling of unease that refused to fade. Who was he? What had happened to him? And most importantly, what was he doing in that alley? Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to the story, something far more sinister than she could have imagined. That afternoon, she sat in her living room, staring at the small television. The news was on, but her mind wasn't really focused on it. She replayed the scene in her mind over and over, each detail more troubling than the last. Her thoughts were interrupted when the doorbell rang. She glanced up in surprise. She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood up and walked cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a man in a suit standing outside. He didn't look like a cop, but the serious expression on his face made her wary. Hesitantly, she opened the door. "Yes? Can I help you?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice cautious. The man smiled politely, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Harris. I'm investigating the case regarding the man found in the alley." Mrs. Jenkins' heart skipped a beat. So they were investigating him now. "Oh, right. Please, come in." She stepped aside, allowing the detective to enter. As he walked in, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Something about this man seemed off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Thank you," Detective Harris said as he sat down on the couch. "I'll get straight to the point. We've been looking into the man found in the alley. His name is Michael Turner. He's a known criminal, and it seems like he's been connected to a much larger operation." Mrs. Jenkins was shocked. She'd never imagined that the man she had found could be involved in anything like that. A criminal. But he looked so helpless. Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Turner is a member of a notorious gang that has been operating in this area for years. He's been involved in a number of shady dealings. But here's the thing. No one has been able to find him for months. He's been hiding out." Mrs. Jenkins felt a chill run down her spine. Hiding out? But why was he left in the alley like that? "That's what we need to figure out," Harris said, his voice low. "It seems like someone wanted him out of the way, but we don't know why." Mrs. Jenkins swallowed hard. Her mind raced. Was it possible that someone was targeting this man? But who would go to such lengths to harm a criminal? And why had he been hidden in the alley, so close to her home? Before she could ask another question, Harris stood up. "We'll be looking into this further, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll keep you updated if I learn anything new." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. Mrs. Jenkins stood still, watching him leave. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, but they weren't fitting the way she expected. What was Michael Turner's role in all of this, and who was behind the dangerous game being played out in her neighborhood? As she closed the door behind him, Mrs. Jenkins felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. There was a bigger story unfolding, something far darker than she had realized. And just as she thought she was starting to understand it, new questions arose. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't get the conversation with Detective Harris out of her mind. She couldn't sit still, so she decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. She needed to clear her head, to make sense of everything. As she walked down the street, she noticed something strange. A black car parked outside an abandoned building. The windows were tinted, and the car looked out of place. It had been there for the last few days, but no one seemed to be around. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she knew she shouldn't get involved. Yet something deep inside her told her to investigate further. She approached the car cautiously, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. When she got closer, she saw a piece of paper sticking out from underneath the windshield wiper. Her heart raced as she reached for it. She pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. The note was short but chilling. "Stop asking questions. Stay out of this if you want to stay safe." Mrs. Jenkins felt her blood run cold. She had been warned. But who had left the note? And why? She looked around again, but the street was still empty. She folded the note back up, her mind reeling. What had she gotten herself into? Why were people trying to stop her from finding out the truth? As she walked back home, the weight of the note hung heavy in her hand. She knew she couldn't back down now. She had to keep going, no matter the risk. Because the more she dug, the more she realized that this was no ordinary crime. It was something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The hidden truth. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Mrs. Jenkins. Each moment was overshadowed by the chilling note left on her doorstep and the unsettling feeling that something dark was brewing just beneath the surface of her quiet neighborhood. She couldn't shake the image of the black car, its tinted windows hiding the face of whoever had been watching her. The warning was clear. Stop asking questions. Stay out of this if you want to stay safe. But as much as she tried to convince herself to ignore the threat, something inside her refused to let go. She had already seen too much: the strange man in the alley, the police investigation, and now the threatening note. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of something much bigger. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't stop now. One afternoon, while she was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the pictures she'd printed out of the scene in the alley, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but she picked up anyway. "Hello," she answered cautiously. "Mrs. Jenkins," a voice on the other end said, and she instantly recognized it as Detective Harris. "I need you to come down to the station. There's something you need to see." Her heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for some answers, but she had no idea what this new development could be. "What is it? What's going on?" "I can't say over the phone," Harris replied. "It's urgent. Can you come now?" Mrs. Jenkins felt a wave of unease wash over her, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, heading toward the police station. As she drove, her mind raced with questions. What had happened? Had they found something new about the man in the alley? Or was it related to the threatening note she had received? When she arrived at the station, Harris was waiting for her in the lobby. He motioned for her to follow him, leading her down a hallway to a small, sterile office. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Mrs. Jenkins sat down, her nerves on edge. Harris closed the door behind him and sat down at his desk. "We've been digging into Michael Turner's past," he began, his voice serious. "And we've uncovered something disturbing." Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, eager for any information. "What did you find?" Harris paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Turner wasn't just a petty criminal. He was part of a much larger organization. "We've traced his connections to a group that's been involved in human trafficking. But that's not the worst part." Mrs. Jenkins felt her stomach churn. Human trafficking. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had never imagined that something so horrific could be tied to the man she had found. "What's the worst part?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The worst part," Harris continued, "is that Turner wasn't just a victim of this group. He was working for them. And now that we found him, he's in danger. The people he was working with are coming for him." Mrs. Jenkins felt her blood run cold. The people he was working with. She had no idea how deep the darkness surrounding this situation went. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We're trying to protect Turner, but we don't have much time. The group he was involved with is ruthless. They'll stop at nothing to keep their operation hidden." Mrs. Jenkins couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had unknowingly stumbled into something far more dangerous than she could have imagined. And now she was caught in the middle of it all. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Harris looked at her, his expression hardening. "We're going to need your help, Mrs. Jenkins. You've seen things that no one else has. We need to know everything you remember about that night. The alley, the man, and anything strange you've noticed since then." She nodded, her mind racing. She had already given the police everything she knew, but now it felt like the stakes were much higher. Her involvement in this case was no longer just a matter of curiosity. Her life, and the life of the mysterious man she had saved, were at risk. "I'll do whatever it takes," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly, determination rising in her chest. "I won't back down now." Harris stood up, extending his hand. "Good. We need all the help we can get." As Mrs. Jenkins left the police station, her mind was filled with a sense of dread and urgency. The truth was out there, hidden in the shadows, but finding it would mean facing dangers she hadn't even begun to understand. The mysterious man in the alley, the human trafficking ring, the ruthless criminals. Everything was connected, and now she was in too deep to turn back. The next step was clear. She had to keep pushing forward, even if it meant risking everything. There was no turning back now. The final confrontation. The days following Mrs. Jenkins' meeting with Detective Harris were filled with a growing sense of unease. The more she learned, the more dangerous the situation seemed. Michael Turner, the man she had saved in the alley, was no longer just a victim. He was a key player in a criminal network so dangerous that even the police seemed to be afraid of crossing them. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that her own life, and the lives of those she cared about, were now at risk. Despite the overwhelming fear, Mrs. Jenkins refused to back down. She had already come too far, and she knew she had a duty to expose the truth. She wasn't about to let these criminals continue their operations in the shadows, destroying countless lives in the process. She spent sleepless nights going over everything she had learned. The details about the human trafficking ring, Turner's involvement, and the mysterious people connected to the group haunted her every moment. It wasn't just about stopping these criminals anymore. It was about saving lives, innocent lives that were at the mercy of this terrifying organization. One afternoon, as she was going through some old case files at home, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her heart stop. Detective Harris. She had been hoping for some good news, but she could feel the weight of the call even before she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice tense. "Mrs. Jenkins," Harris began, his voice filled with urgency. "We've got a lead on Turner. He's been spotted near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. We think he's being held there, but we don't know for how long." A surge of adrenaline rushed through Mrs. Jenkins' body. She knew this could be the break they'd been waiting for. The warehouse was notorious for being a hub for illegal activities, and if they were able to find Turner, it could lead them straight to the heart of the criminal network. "We're going in," Harris continued, "but I need you to stay back. This could get dangerous." "I'm not staying back," Mrs. Jenkins replied firmly. "I've already put too much on the line. I'm coming with you." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is not something you're prepared for. You don't know what you're walking into." "I know enough," she answered, her voice unwavering. "I've seen what these people are capable of. I won't sit back and let you go alone." Harris finally relented. "All right, but you need to follow my lead. No matter what happens, stay close and stay quiet." Within the hour, Mrs. Jenkins found herself in a police convoy, heading toward the old warehouse. The streets were eerily quiet, and the closer they got, the more Mrs. Jenkins felt the weight of the situation. She had no idea what she was about to walk into, but she knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. As they arrived at the warehouse, the team quickly surrounded the building, positioning themselves in the shadows, waiting for the signal. Mrs. Jenkins felt her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but the anxiety was overwhelming. Every part of her screamed for safety, but she pushed the fear aside. There was no room for fear now. The signal was given, and the police stormed the warehouse, their guns drawn. Mrs. Jenkins followed closely behind, her senses on high alert. She could hear the shouts of the officers, the clatter of their footsteps echoing through the vast, empty space. They reached the back of the warehouse, where they found a group of men standing guard over a locked door. Harris signaled for the team to take position, and they quietly approached, ready to move in. Mrs. Jenkins held her breath, waiting for the moment that would change everything. As the team busted down the door, they found Turner, looking battered and weak, but alive. He was tied to a chair, but his eyes lit up when he saw the officers. "Help me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They've been trying to kill me." Before anyone could respond, gunshots rang out from the far side of the room. A masked figure appeared in the shadows, firing at the officers. Chaos erupted. The police returned fire, shouting orders as they fought to subdue the attackers. Mrs. Jenkins ducked behind a stack of crates, her heart racing. She watched as Harris and the other officers engaged in a tense firefight with the criminals. The gunshots were deafening, and she could feel the tension in the air, thick with the weight of the moment. Just as things seemed to reach a breaking point, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. One of the officers had managed to disarm the masked figure, bringing the fight to a sudden halt. The room fell into a tense silence. Mrs. Jenkins couldn't believe it. It was over. The criminals had been taken down, and Turner was safe. As the police cuffed the last of the criminals, Harris approached Mrs. Jenkins. He looked at her with a mix of admiration and relief. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved his life, and in the process, you helped us take down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations we've ever faced." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, her voice soft. "We all did it together." But as she looked around at the wreckage of the warehouse, the sense of danger still hung in the air. The fight was over, but the scars would remain. The truth had been uncovered, the criminals had been brought to justice, and Turner had been saved. But the journey had changed Mrs. Jenkins forever. She would never look at her quiet neighborhood in the same way again. The world was darker than she had ever known, but with people like her, there was still hope.